pretty much every single thing that's going wrong with Labour right now, I would say, has come from the corruption of vested interests and money from oil and gas companies, gambling companies, arms trade companies, private healthcare companies. They don't do that, out of goodwill. They're expecting things in return. And I think as soon as you started to go down that path, you're into very dodgy territory. 90% of Green Party funding at the moment is from regular donations from members. I'm not being complacent. There's still lots of work to do, and I'd still take regular donations. But it's very fair to say that a lot of the pressure that has been on the party for the last 10, 20 years on a total shoestring budget has just quite dramatically changed. We cannot fall into the trap where people are just excited about a new leader or a new political project. The more important stage is, what do you do with that energy? How do you make sure that you're organising in your communities and you actually win elections? Because I don't want to be the political party leader that has a mass membership. I definitely would take that. But then the much more important bit is, what do you do with that membership and how do you take the fight to reform?
Good morning, Zack Polanski.
Morning.
How are you?
I'm good. Slightly cold, but going straight in there with a complaint about the temperature of the studio and also the temperature of the world. But let's not encourage global warming.
I thought you'd think positively about the cold weather. Isn't this how you want it?
For that. Well, it's extreme temperatures, isn't it? It's the cold, the heat of the summer.
This is the Britain that you want. Zack,
look, I'm really happy to be here. I should have just started with that.
Zack, you've got some fresh news about the membership, haven't you?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So today we're announcing we've just hit 170,000 members, which is incredible. But the particularly interesting stat is that's 100,000 new members since the day I was elected, which is just over 2 months ago, which is wild. I'm not going to put any other description on it. It's amazing. And also no complacency, because we've got a whole load of new members to join as well. Maybe even people watching this interview right now at join.greenparty.org.uk.
Okay, we'll get it in early. We get it in early. 100,000 new members. I mean, what do you think it is? What are you doing to attract this many people to the Green Party?
I think, and there's a huge positive to this, and there's also a warning in it too. The huge positive is everywhere I'm going, every train I'm on, even it's happened when I'm on my bike at a red light, people coming over to me and going, "You're making me feel hope. I'm feeling so inspired and excited." And that is amazing. And there's no other word for it. And I take that really, really seriously. And I'm moving into a second phase now, which very quickly is to turn to people and go, "I'm really glad you're excited. I'm excited too. Have you joined the party? And have you turned up to a local party meeting yet?" Because we cannot fall into the trap where people are just excited about a new leader or a new political project. That's kind of stage one, and I'm really delighted that's happening. But stage two, and arguably the more important stage, is, what do you do with that energy? How do you make sure that you're organising in your communities and you actually win elections? Because I don't want to be the political party leader that has a mass membership. I definitely would take that. But then the much more important bit is, what do you do with that membership and how do you take the fight to reform?
Because this is where it gets tricky, because you have a one member, one vote system. Even people who are going to stand in elections, that's got to be approved by the membership, right? So Can you sort of explain that mechanism briefly for people who don't quite understand? Because you're going to be looking ahead to next year and selections. It's going to be rather different from, say, how the Labour Party conduct their selections. How do you go about it?
Yeah, so it's entirely grassroots up. I have as much power in this party as someone who's been a member for the last 20 years, or even someone who joins today. And I think that's something I'd always defend. I think it's really, really important that everyone at the table has an equal vote. Now, so I'm not being disingenuous about it. I'm at a microphone a lot more than other members. I get to set the narrative, and I won the leadership on 85% of the vote, and we've had 100,000 new members since then. So there's a lot of kind of soft power. That was a low-level swing, wasn't it? And so that soft power is really important in terms of, how do you tell the narrative and how do you make it clear what the values of the party are? And I definitely haven't changed those values. Those values have been there, to be honest, since the day the party was formed. I think what's changed is the way I'm communicating about that, and we're clearly getting more coverage than ever before. But in terms of the decisions that are made on the day-to-day or about elections, I think it's only right that the local people in that community should go to a hustings, which is just a debate where every candidate who wants to stand puts forward their argument, and then the members have a vote to decide who their candidate is, and then, of course, the electorate then have a decision at election time. I think that's the right way to do things, because that stops the kind of vested interests or major donors being able to put money into candidates and then trying to influence parties to make the top-down approach. Pretty much every single thing that's going wrong with Labour right now, I would say, has come from the corruption of vested interests and money from oil and gas companies, gambling companies, arms trade companies, private healthcare companies. I think when you pay people the amount of, or when you donate to people the amount of money that they're donating, They don't do that, out of goodwill. They're expecting things in return. And I think as soon as you started to go down that path, you're into very dodgy territory. And what I'm really proud about the Green Party is we have two vested interests: to protect people and to protect the planet. And other than that, you're just looking for the best candidate.
Can I pull you up on that a little bit there? Because you're saying that candidates, they won't be subject to or open to donations and therefore won't be able to promote themselves. But what is stopping them from launching their own social media campaign that might be backed by a donor that would ingratiate them further with the membership, that might elevate them and have them more visible on the stage?
Yeah, so a really good question that hasn't necessarily been a problem before in the past, because the level of selections haven't been so competitive that someone would take that kind of money. I think, again, I trust grassroots democracy. I think the membership would see that, and I think they would take a pretty poor view, I imagine, of any candidate that they felt was trying to do a Donald Trump or trying to use money to amplify their message overly. I think people, whether it's at that local level in terms of the local selection candidate or the actual election itself, I think people really want to see someone who's genuinely embedded in the community. I think there is a wider question, though, you're asking there about money in politics and how do we make sure that we have more transparency and more accountability, whilst recognizing that campaigns do have to be funded and resourced, because we know that the right wing certainly have got their stuff together in terms of the amount that they take and the amount of money they're pumping into politics. 90% of Green Party funding at the moment is from regular donations from members. We're never going to take dirty money from multimillionaires and billionaires. I do think there's a live and active conversation about how do you work with big business that is aligned with your values. So you're auditing them properly. You're not taking the money because you desperately need it. And that's a really nice thing about having so many new members. The party is in a better financial position than it could have possibly dreamed of being. I'm not being complacent. There's still lots of work to do, and I'd still take regular donations. But it's very fair to say that a lot of the pressure that has been on the party for the last 10, 20 years on a total shoestring budget has just quite dramatically changed.
So it's a gentleman's agreement, really. It's there's not an outright ban on candidates taking donations. It's this may not appeal to the current membership, so I'd rather you didn't do it.
I'm glad you had a follow-up, because there are rules. So I can't remember the exact number, but it's actually quite low. I think it might even be £500 that a candidate can spend on a local election campaign.
£500?
In my
the Americans are shaking. Like,
in my campaign to be leader, which was like about a 2-3 month campaign, the election limit I think was £1,000, and that's I mean that's wild for a national election. I think that's probably too low. But again, it's one member, one vote. So that's a conversation the party will have more nationally. And it's probably not for me as leader to wade into like leadership election results, rules in the future. But I think that there's a big difference between £1,000 and £1 million. I think there's probably something sensible in between.
Yeah. I think that the one member, one vote is interesting, because while that does appeal to people who are signing up, that there are concerns that could arise later down the line. I mean, one of the biggest policies that you have been touting over the last few weeks that has proved very popular is the wealth tax. If you get to a situation where you are at conference where there are members of your party who oppose a wealth tax, what do you say to them? How do you combat that? Do you sort of blanket ban it? I know you don't have a whip with the Green Party. So how do you convince them that that's the right platform?
Well, I think this is the biggest thing missing from politics right across the world, but particularly in this country right now, is this idea that I remember when Ed Miliband was leader, there was a talk at one point about how he was going to be a blank sheet. He was going to go listen to members. And I think there's like a beautiful sincerity to that, which I really like, and I want to take part of that. Where I think politics has often got to is we've got the right answers, we're going to focus group it, then we're going to lecture you to it. And I think the real answer is somewhere in between, which is to be really clear about your values, really clear about the story that you're telling. Check where people are, but not run over to them and go, oh, you're over there, so I'm just going to go join you now because that's leadership. But actually to say, this is where I am, this is where you are, there's going to be a negotiation now. I'm going to tell the story and try and get you to come closer to me. I'm going to come a bit closer to you. And to negotiate where you're not compromising on your values, but the story you're telling, make sure that the people who are most involved are essentially the protagonists of that story. And I think that's where that's most important, is co-design. So if you're working on policy for minority communities or disabled people or whoever it might be, that they're at the center of the storytelling from the very beginning. So you don't decide your story, then go to that community and go, oh, we're consulting, but really we're notifying you. What you do is from the very beginning go, this is where we want to get to. these are the problems I can foresee. How can we work together with you as a community to find something that is working here for everyone? Will that always be an easy process? Absolutely not. But I don't think politics should be an easy process. The whole point of politics is that competing ideas and competing values come together in tension. And actually, there's sort of a fusion of what can be even better when you've worked through that. And I just think that political leadership has been missing from our conversation. It's far too often politicians running terrified of what the public might think, which even that phrase, they'll go, well, of course we've got to care what the public think. We have to win elections. Absolutely. But what I think Mamdani in New York has demonstrated more than a politician I can remember for a long time is if you're really clear about your values and you tell an amazing story, people will come to you, even if they disagree with some of your policies or even if they're not sure about some of the things you say. If they know that you believe what you're saying, if they know that you're going to be straight with them, and even where you disagree, you're going to look them in the eyes and just bat it straight, I think that's what politics people are looking for. And then on the wealth tax, which I know is just an example, wealth tax is incredibly popular, not just with Green Party members, but with the public as well, which is why it is beyond astonishing that the Labour government won't back it or even move to it. I say it's astonishing. It's not astonishing because we come back to the same conversation that they have been bought and paid for by multimillionaires and billionaires. So, of course, they're not going to work with the wealth tax. But that's a real example of why we need to get big money out of politics and actually have storytelling and communities at the heart of it.
Do you think it would be helpful, or do you think you will have to move to a position where you have sort of, guiding foundation principles of the Green Party, where perhaps you don't join the Green Party if you don't want to have certain policies? I mean, one of the things that have come up, and I was speaking to Lloyd Russel-Moyle yesterday, who had just defected from the Labour Party, I think much to all of your delight. He sort of has a Sean Berry way of talking about planning applications and talking about housing. He really does believe that these issues should be settled locally. You know, one of the founding principles that I've heard you talking about on broadcast over the last couple of months has been an expansion of building. It's been, we've got to bring in renewable energy. Well, you've got to blitz through planning applications. What happens if every single local area turns around to you and says no?
Well, more widely, and then I'll answer the question very directly. The values, I think, are really clear. And I think in terms of what is the mechanism in which to communicate that values, it's me, it's the deputy leadership, it's our spokespeople, it's every single MP. And we're all on the same page that this party is about environmental, social, racial, and economic justice. And that very broadly is the values of the party. More specifically, red lines for me are homophobia, transphobia, racism, misogyny. We don't go near those. So those are the red lines. And I think once you're really clear what your red lines are...
Would you kick out a member if they did display transphobia?
Yes, transphobia is absolutely unacceptable. It's unacceptable in society. I'm not in charge of society, sadly. But I do lead the Green Party, and transphobia is totally unacceptable in the Green Party. And I don't think that's nuanced. I don't think it's complicated. I think that just needs to be stated really clearly. In terms of planning applications, so the reason why I started there is I think once you've made your red lines really, really clear, everything in between there then becomes up for negotiation. And I think that's exactly what a party should be. It should be a broad coalition of different ideas, of people who disagree with each other, but have the same red line values, which is why it's really important you're clear about those values. In terms of planning applications, I think it's just really important that actually the local level is properly represented by a local MP who can speak up for the community in the exact same way we were just talking about. I don't think that just means though saying what they want to hear or just repeating what they're saying without a conversation or negotiation. I think that's different to the role of a party leader or a national figure who I think's job is on a strategic, holistic level to say this is what the country needs, whether it's about the climate crisis, the air pollution crisis, the inequality crisis, to be really clear about those values and the direction of the country. And then I think it's up to those local MPs or local councillors to negotiate and level that out. Is that messy? Yes, it's incredibly messy. But I think we've got to the point. So this kind of idea of NIMBYism, I think, has been one of the most corrosive ideas in politics, because I think NIMBYism does definitely exist. But a lot of the time, what I hear described as NIMBYism, I would say that's not accurate. So let's look at house building, for instance. We have a housing crisis, and I couldn't be clearer about that. I say it repeatedly. We have over 1 million households on the waiting list, and we badly need council homes. What I see over and over again, though, is applications from property developers for unaffordable luxury buildings that no one will live in. And that's on a good day, by the way, because what I see much more frequently is property developers who are land banking. So they have the land and they're just not building on it. And, I could blame them for that, and I absolutely do. But also, they're doing the logical thing in a free market system. If you say to property developers, if profit margin is the most important thing to you, and land banking is more profitable than actually building a house that someone can live in, then of course they're going to make that decision, which is why this idea of no state intervention into house building or just allowing the property market to run away with it has been so disastrous for the homes and communities we need.
So more control over housing, more state intervention. Does that extend to renters as well?
Oh, yeah, I think we absolutely need rent controls as well. I think the housing market and the rental market have been so badly broken. And I think, again, it's been by just allowing privatization and the market to be the king or queen of everything and just to run away with that. And I think we absolutely do need to make sure that local authorities in particular have more controls. Now, having said all of that, so then you say that, and then the government shout NIMBY at you, or that you're trying to protect bats and newts, despite the fact that we live in one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. And if we lose nature and we have a nature crisis, we have nothing else. We just literally collapse. Notice that the government never talk about badgers or otters because they're considered cute by the public, and they would sound pretty awful if they said they didn't care about them. So they pick some species that they know people generally find weird or a little bit icky. I love bats and newts, by the way. Of course I do.
My sister did it the other day. Do you know one flew into her face when she was in her bed? She didn't love it then.
Don't let Rachel Reeves know. She'll carry on that campaign.
Be all over it.
I was about to say was it a bat or a newt, but since you said flu, I'm going to take it as a bat. And so none of that is NIMBYism. That's about protecting nature and saying, let's build the housing that this country needs. Is there a strand, though, of people who just want their pretty view of the countryside and will protest anything that destroys their view or brings down the house price? Yes, that exists too. And I think it's fair to say that's NIMBYism. But the conflation of what the Green Party is saying in terms of let's build houses, let's make sure that the right houses at the right price in the right place, with the kind of NIMBYism that you see in other communities, I think has been pretty corrosive, both for politics, but actually for making the right decisions about protecting nature and building houses.
Because this is what this is what Adrian Ramsey was accused of during it came up repeatedly during your leadership contest. Adrian Ramsey opposed some pylons in his constituency. I have asked you about this before, and I appreciate that. But what I'm more interested in is...
I need to, because otherwise Adrian will say you didn't correct.
Okay.
So he didn't actually oppose them. What he said was that the people in the community should have a consultation on what alternatives there were to the pylons. And I know that can sound like semantics. But when
he wanted them to go underground, didn't he? Which is at exorbitant cost.
Yeah, well, he wanted to look at the cost of what going underground was. And to be clear, if you ask me, going underground, I know can often be more ecologically destructive and can cost more money. So it doesn't make sense to me as a solution. But what does make sense to me is for a local MP to say, I've got people who are unhappy. There might be other alternatives. Let's have a consultation into what we think those alternatives are and cost them. I think that's a really reasonable position to take.
Yeah. I think that what happens though, if you were in government, say, and one of your MPs, we won't use Adrian as the direct example here, we're talking sort of more broadly, if one of your MPs opposed a wind farm, a solar farm, what would you say to them?
Well, I think there's what you'd say informally, and then there's how you'd handle it in public. So
come on, give us the informal.
Well,
I think that would be more juicy,
important,
wouldn't it?
Is to sit down with that MP and go, what is going on? This is potentially embarrassing. This is the opposite of what the party is talking about and our values. Why are you making these decisions? And then it would be up for me to listen to go, actually, I can get where they're coming from and I'm going to go out there and bat for them, or I don't care where they're coming from. You're on your own. I'm just going to be clear in interviews what our values are as a party, and you need to go talk to that MP. That's then up to the local constituents of that MP in terms of the local party to go, yeah, they've made the right decision here and they're doing what I want, which is what a local MP should be doing. Or no, this doesn't quite make sense and we have mandatory reselection, so your job next time is probably not gonna be there. And I think that's democracy, and I think that's how it works. And when I say informally, I don't mean that inside kind of some secret back room. I just think it's important that human beings have relationships with each other where they understand each other. And then when you go out in public, you either decide you have a united front where you say, we're a team, I'm backing you to the hilt here. Or you go, we're a team, but on this decision, I disagree, and I'm going to be honest about that, and you're going to have to defend it.
Mandatory reselection is really interesting, isn't it? Because then you don't end up in a situation that the Conservatives have found themselves in, where you sort of have MPs presiding over a constituency for going on 30, 40 years. Is the intent of that you're constantly accountable?
Yeah,
Is that the...
it's exactly that. And I have mandatory reselections as leader too. We have pretty regular leadership contests in the Green Party. And I think that's really important because I think there's a balance, right? I think some members of the Green Party, and I'm definitely not disparaging some members of the Green Party, but they love democracy. And if they could, they would vote on things every single day, probably every hour of the day. They'd be like, let's get an app and let's just keep voting. And we know this from like ancient kind of Greece with how democracy worked in terms of the populace deciding, is everyone going to vote on referendums all the time? And then at some point they said, let's have delegated or representative democracy. And so that's what we have. I don't think people want to vote on things all the time. I don't want to vote on things all the time. Like it takes a lot of time out of the day to keep having to learn about things and read about things and then go immediately vote on those things. I think there are crucial things that need to be voted on and understood.
I think the app sounds quite a good idea, actually. A really good, clear way.
I've planted an idea in people's minds now.
Let's talk about another, someone else who's been accused of...
But something I really like about Lloyd that I didn't know till I spoke to him about it the other day is even when he was in the Labour Party, he pushed for reselection of his own seat. Because he felt it was an important principle that local people had that kind of regular check-in and constant decision over who their local MP is. And I just think, again, that really speaks to the values of someone who understands democracy and grassroots democracy, rather than I won this seat at a local selection 20 years ago, I've been the MP, and now I'm going to do what I want, and I'm just going to enjoy sitting on the back benches, and you as the local party in a potentially safe seat have no say in this. That seems so deeply undemocratic.
Well, you know, that sort of dangerous thinking is perhaps one of the reasons why he was deselected from that seat by Starmer and Morgan McSweeney. Let's talk about someone else who's been accused of NIMBYism. Rachel Millward in Sussex has opposed the housing of 600 asylum seekers in a former, well, actually some would even say active military barracks, because there is still some activity there. Do you think she was right to oppose that?
Yeah, I think this one's maybe even more outrageous than the housing example we were just talking about. This is very specific, and there isn't a huge lot of nuance to it, so it's much easier to explain. 600 people who potentially have been fleeing war and persecution, looking for a better life, being put inside an army barracks is outrageous. That's outrageous for the 600 people who deserve better housing and better accommodation than that, and better dignity and humanity. And it's not good for the community either to have suddenly 600 people turn up in an army barracks without necessarily infrastructure. We have a housing crisis. We just talked about that. We also have lots of buildings that are disused that could be used for temporary accommodation. We can tackle both the housing crisis by making sure we're bringing some of those empty buildings back into use. They can both be used for the community and for some of the most vulnerable yet resilient people in the world who need accommodation. It's this outrageous constant pitting of communities against people seeking asylum, as opposed to going holistically, how can we solve both of these problems? Now, if you were an angry right-wing journalist, which I know you're not, you'd immediately go, but do we not need to prioritize the people who live in those communities already? And I think it's, again, the prioritization idea. I've just asked myself a question and then kind of tripped myself up. It's not about prioritization. You can do all of these things at the same time. And so there's kind of this false equivalence all the time of what's the first immediate thing you do. But actually, I don't think it's outside the wit of local councils and, more importantly, government to be able to go, we can protect people who are homelessness and make sure we get them into homes, and we can protect people fleeing war and persecution at the same time. We don't need to pit these communities against each other. And so these accusations of NIMBYism of Rachel, who has been so clear over and over again that she stands with refugees, that she wants to see a fair migration system, and that also she wants to see people put, by the way, not even in hotels. The hotels are also problematic. We have organizations or corporations like Clear Springs who are taking very lucrative contracts from the government, ripping off the government, which is really ripping off the taxpayer, every single one of us, by overinflating the price of a hotel, having people in there. Reports, I've not been in one of these hotels, but from the reports I understand, are often pretty awful, putrid conditions where people aren't being kept in suitable accommodation. We're all being overcharged for that. And it's so temporary, that's no long-term fix to what is becoming a problem. And so the long-term fix is to go, how do we treat people with humanity and dignity? How do we make sure, first of all, we have asylum centres in the countries that they arrive in so people don't need to come over by small boat, for instance. So we need safe and managed routes. Only 5% of migration is by small boats, but obviously on a lot of other media channels, that's 95% of the coverage. So we really need to challenge this idea that everyone's coming over from small boats. But if you have got on a small boat, and I think this is the most important point, you are risking your life. There's no real deterrent from that. Like seizing someone's assets or jewelry or putting someone in an army barracks is not the thing that's going to stop them getting on the small boat. The thing that will stop them getting on the small boat is if you allow them to have a proper processing centre where there can be a decision made whether the person has a legitimate claim to asylum or not. And then you can give them a safe and managed route. And all of this is such a manufactured crisis because in 2016, those asylum centres were shut down to deliberately create a backlog to then put people in hotels for the Conservative government to point at the queues of people. And it's important to say not huge amounts of people, but yes, definitely rising. And to point at them and go, these people are your problem. And the absolute cowardice of this government, just complete wimps, to rather than take on multimillionaires and billionaires and corporate interests and actually do the things that need to be doing to punch up effectively, metaphorically.
So
they're going after some of the most vulnerable people in the world. It's disgusting.
Is the process here, is the solution then, in the Green Party's view, that you blitz through that asylum backlog, you have people working and you don't have them living in hotels? Is that the route that you're looking at? Because I think that's what Labour were reticent about, right? When they first got into government, they blitzed through the asylum applications.
Yeah.
Over 80% of them were accepted. They got a few headlines that frightened them.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. And I think there's also a key point in what you're saying. People go, but they're not working. That's because they're not allowed to work. And the utter absurdity and incoherency of that position and the cruelty of maintaining that position and then demonizing them and then trying to divide us and say that they're the problem when you have literally, it's not fair to say they've created the problem, but they've exacerbated the problem by allowing it to continue. Whereas actually, safe and managed routes and allow people to work. And I'm not saying there won't ever be a problem. I'm not saying someone seeking asylum won't ever commit a crime or do something awful. But people in Britain commit crimes and do things awful.
They're not a homogenous monolith.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
People are human beings.
Yeah. Speaking of asylum seekers, and this is going to be an extraordinary segue.
I'm curious about the smile.
People have been displaced over the last few years, particularly around Ukraine. Many people have had to come to the United Kingdom in order to seek refuge. You're not a big fan of NATO. You're not a big fan of America's involvement in NATO. Are you concerned that if perhaps NATO were to fall apart, there would be more of an influx of people, more of a movement of people, not necessarily to the UK, but more people who are displaced around the world?
I'd be concerned about anyone being displaced. I don't think that's going to come from a disbanding of NATO. I think actually the opposite, when you often look at British interventions alongside NATO in Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, that's often led to a much further displacing of people. There's a much more complicated question there about how, when is foreign intervention appropriate or not. But I think it would be a stretch to say that NATO has been particularly helpful in stopping displacing people.
Do you think
you
it's
mentioned
caused some of
Ukraine,
that
and I think
displacement?
that's really important because Ukraine is an example of where we've rightly had a good migration and refugee system, where we had the Homes for Ukraine program, we welcomed people and we made sure they were supported, and that's absolutely right. In the same way that we support sovereignty for Palestinians, we also support sovereignty for Ukrainians. It's very, very striking, though, that people who predominantly have white skin from Europe were treated in that way compared to, again, the countries that I just named, where there's been very little programs. And in fact, the opposite, there's been this kind of inhumanity towards people from those countries. In NATO more widely, it's important to say that we need an alternative. So it's not about NATO disbanding today or tomorrow. That clearly wouldn't be helpful for anyone. But European countries are already talking about what does a closer alliance with Europe look like, where we're working with our European neighbours. Brexit, I think, was one of the most catastrophic decisions this country has ever made, both economically, most obviously, but also socially and culturally. And also, I think it's left us less safe as well, because it means we've got more reliance on America. There's often this conversation about nuclear weapons. I think what people don't know is we don't actually have nuclear weapons. in any real sense. Donald Trump has the kill switch to our nuclear weapons. So we can't even use our own defense or weapons
We do
without
pay to
relying on
service
America.
them, though.
Right, quite. And
Do you
so
think we're overly reliant on America? Do you think that that's a good friend or a good alliance to have as a sole partner? Do you think that they can be fair weather in their approach to the UK?
there's not enough hyperbole for how much I distrust Donald Trump. And I think any reliance, never mind over reliance on Donald Trump, is a catastrophic decision. This is a man who is a misogynist, a racist. He's someone who's threatening to annex Greenland and Canada. I don't know how King Charles feels about that. And the idea that this is someone who's a reliable partner, and just be clear, I don't want to use Donald Trump as an excuse. If you'd asked me this question with other presidents, I would have had a skepticism towards American imperialism. But under Donald Trump, I don't think, again, there's particularly a lot of nuance here. I think this is a man who has been deeply unreliable, even to his own allies. He brought Zelensky into the White House and shamed him, and then said that he admired President Putin. A deeply problematic person. And the fact that we wouldn't rely, I mean, ultimately, I don't even want to rely on Europe. I want to create closer relationships with them without making an overly nationalistic argument. I do think when we talk about defense and our security, let's think about our own national security. How do we make sure that we're investing in this country, that we don't have homeless veterans sleeping on the streets, that we make sure
Get them back to work. Is that what you're saying?
well, just that we have the actual appropriate defense in place. I think we've got to stop thinking of ourselves, this is it. We have an over-reliance on this idea of us as a global power. And I think those times have gone. I think we should be looking at how do we make sure we focus on our own national security and making sure we're protecting this country rather than this kind of cosplaying of having to, Keir Starmer appearing in tanks or appearing, he's not appeared on a tank to be fair, but with his hard hat and his army uniform in other countries. And I just think it's a day gone by, which isn't a day we should necessarily be particularly proud of either.
Well, a lot of that foreign policy as well, the close relationship with America dictates how we tax certain American corporations that operate in the UK. If you were to get into government, would you be going after those companies? I mean, for example, we're looking at big social media corporations, whether that's X, Meta, Google. If we're looking at, card companies, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, would you be taxing them?
Absolutely. And by the way, this is something Keir Starmer was talking about, particularly with the tech industry, before he got into power. And then the TUC have run an amazing campaign with creative workers, talking about their collective bargaining rights. And then Peter Kyle just seemed to go straight to the tech bros. I was on Laura Kuenssberg the same morning as Elton John, so this is his quote, not mine. He was asked about Peter Kyle. His response was, Peter Kyle's a moron. And I think, what Elton John said might have some resonance there. I think more widely, though, it's all of those firms, and I would say it's even darker than that. So if we look at Palantir, or certainly some of the UK government's response to Palestine action, there's a fairly legitimate and coherent thread, I would say, between Donald Trump's intervention into what he didn't want the UK to be talking about with Palestine and the authoritarian crackdown on people's right to protest. And I think a crackdown on protest is worrying anyway, but when then you add that extra layer of corporate influence and lobbying, then I think that's it's pretty dystopian.
I know you've got to go. I'd actually love to have delved into that a little bit more. That was very interesting. So you have to come back. But just to sort of end.
Imagine if I go, I'm never coming back. This is it.
Yeah.
So last interview.
Zack, if you could fix one weakness in your party, what would it be?
Whew. I mean, the obvious one would to go. I'll give you the obvious one because it's a cop-out, and then I'll give you a real one once I've bought myself 20 seconds to think. The obvious one is a cop-out is the lack of funding. So although we've had more money now, what we're able to do now is do much more basic operations in a way that is funded properly. So we've got a better foundation, and then we can move on. So donate to the Green Party. But that's a cop-out answer. I think the real answer is that I've defended our democratic structures, and I always would, so I don't want anyone to hear any different from this answer. I do think sometimes we have an over-reliance on democracy, and actually I think we could have more of a trust, particularly of our spokespeople, to allow them. So if you ask me a question, for instance, that we don't have party policy on, the technical answer I have to give you back is we don't have party policy on that. I'm going to get back to you, which clearly is just not going to work in today's media environment. And so unofficially, I think we've got over that as a party, that when we elect leadership, we generally trust them, that as long as they're aligned with the values that we voted on, then we're not going to be in trouble unless you break those values, and then you should be in trouble. But I'd like to see that more relaxed, so that we've got more of an agility to be able to respond to the day-to-day. But I think that's happening already. But I'd like to see us continue to go down that path, because I think sometimes an over-reliance on democracy can be a weakness.
I would just say I don't think it was a cop-out, by the way, the funding answer.
I should have just stopped there.
No, I know, honestly, I could have. But I think that's actually really interesting, because if you are trying to build a movement that is free from corporate interests or free from lobbyists, the reality is it is pretty difficult.
And can I give you some numbers? I was going to say, don't quote me. I'm in an interview. I'm obviously being quoted. I'm paraphrasing the numbers. They're not exact. But the Green Party in the last general election spent about £1 million, or I think £1.4 million. I think the next, surprisingly, actually, were Reform, who were about £5 million, or 4.8, I think. Then if we go a bit higher, we're at £23 million, which is the Liberal Democrats. And then I think the Labour government spent something like £45 million. And they won. So who knew it? Money in politics is pretty important. I don't think it's the only thing. And I think, as we're seeing again, the Labour government have lots of money and tanking in the polls badly, and I think deserve to, because they don't really stand for anything. But lack of money means your ability to get your message heard, no matter how good it is, can hold you back. We've broken through a little bit with that just by using social media. We've hardly spent anything on social media, but just organic reach has changed. So lots of people are joining the party through that. But I imagine there's probably a ceiling to that. And actually, at some point, you do just need more money for your operation.
Great. I'm going to end there. Otherwise, someone off camera is going to
Georgia
strangle
going
me.
to get a second mention on the podcast. This is the amazing Georgia Nelson, who runs my entire operation and will take a journalist down if they make me late.
You can't see, but she's actually clawing at the curtain here. She's about to take me out. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Zack.
Thank you.